everybody, and welcome to Book Banter. I'm Raina Nielsen from Blue Cypress Books, and this evening I will be talking to Gina Ferrara. Her newest poetry collection, Amiss, is a collection of beautiful, haunting poems that it brings to mind a good article that makes you feel the story. Like I can't wait for her to explain to you the inspiration behind these poems, and I'm definitely going to let her do that. Remember that throughout the event, if you have any questions for myself or for Gina or want to make a comment, just type them into the comments below and we will answer any of those questions in real time. So without further ado, I'm going to click this button and welcome Gina. Hi to Book Banter.
Hi, hello.
Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yay. I sort of stumbled on my feelings about this book, but I really do feel each poem kind of invokes this. It's like the heart behind a news article that I want to be happening. If that makes it, that's like a better way. That's what I felt, because I know your inspiration for these poems, and I would like to let you sort of give the elevator pitch type about this book. Tell us your inspiration for Amiss to get us started.
All right. So, first of all, thank you again for having me on. I'm really delighted to be here. So this book began in 2019. Probably around the summer of 2019. There was a story that came out in the news, and the story was about a woman named Linda O'Keefe. And Linda O'Keefe in 1973, she was maybe 10 or 11 years old. She lived in Newport Beach, California. And she was murdered in 1973. And the case was cold until 2019. What happened was the Newport Beach Police Department decided to do a couple of things. The first thing that they did was they started using Twitter and social media platforms to really kind of like to create an account that it seemed like Linda was talking from the grave. They did that in hopes that they would kind of jog people's memories. The second thing that happened was that they took DNA that had been recovered from the crime scene because her body was discovered after she went missing. They took DNA from the crime scene and they sent that DNA to a genealogical website. And there was a match. And the match was a man. His name was James Allen Neal. He was living in Colorado. He had a family, children, grandchildren. He was arrested and he was in jail, and he died in 2020. It was believed that maybe he had died of COVID because this would have been the early days of COVID. So the thing about Linda O'Keefe was that we were about the same age when this happened. And I remember when I was that age, my mother, every single time I left the house, and you probably know this too, you probably heard it too, it was, don't stop to talk to strangers. If anybody tries to get you, run, scream. And so it seemed like that was such a fear of my mother's at that time. For me, I always thought it was because my one grandfather was a horse race handicapper.
Okay.
And the other had like a gambling hall secret in the French Quarter. And so it could have been maybe a bet that didn't go right or a gambling debt that needed to be settled. Like maybe that would have been the reason for my mother saying this. But then, as I got a little bit older, I kind of realized, of course, what she was warning me, what she wanted me to stay away from.
Mhm.
And so I think because O'Keefe and I, we were the same age, looking at her, I felt like I was looking at myself, like photographs from that time, what she was wearing, the way she wore her hair. And so the story really, really captured me. And I wrote a poem about that. And then, like maybe within a week or two after that, there was a story about two young girls in Iowa. Same kind of thing. Those girls went off, they went riding their bikes. Their bodies were found, but the killer was not. And then maybe a short time after that, a story about a young woman in Kentucky. And so these three things kind of clustered, came together, and I began to write. I wrote poems, one kind of based on Linda O'Keefe, actually two based on her, and then the others were about the other victims. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm not just going to stop with these three or four poems. I'm going to keep going. And so that's when I started doing my research. And I decided that I would have a poem about a victim in each state. And so that's kind of how all of this got started.
Wow. So did you, when you got past those three that sort of organically came to you, did you go looking? You had to have gone looking at some point to get one for each state. Um, what was that like? What do you type in? Like missing woman, Minnesota, and then just wow, that process doesn't sound easy.
It was not easy. I mean, because it was so the when I decided that I wanted to kind of write a poem for a woman in each state, the first thing that I did was I printed out a map of the United States, and so then I just would kind of pick a state at random, and it would be victim murder, missing women in Virginia, and the list would come. And so probably when I was doing the research, easily I could have read 200 to 250 stories about missing women. So it was not an easy process, but it was a process that I felt like really obsessed with in a way. Like once I kind of got going with this, I was not going to let it go. And I felt like I was being pushed to really kind of get these poems out. But the process itself, no, it was not easy. I felt like I had maps and articles um, and probably initially, like the initial writing of the poems, I would say maybe took about 4 to 5 months. Um, so they were kind of quick, but then I put them on the shelf because in 2020, I actually had another book, Way to the Ripened. It's around here somewhere.
Mhm.
That came out in March of 2020. And then we had the pandemic. And, whose life was the same after that, right? And so I put the poems kind of on a shelf until like maybe 2022. I revisited them and then kind of started working them over again.
Well, and I imagine too, like you've got this book that comes out, and then you're like, well, should I start working on Amiss? But who wants to deal with more trauma and missing people and all of that when you're looking around and the world is so chaotic. So I imagine there was a time period there where you're just like, no, I can't yet.
Right. And so I was worried about that, and so kind of one of the things that I wanted to do was I didn't want to focus on the often gory circumstances.
Right.
I didn't want to focus on those at all. What I kind of decided that I would do was I would kind of look at each victim, see um, where she lived, when she lived, and 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 then I decided that I would make these more like poetic vignettes specific to each woman, because my gosh, if I would have had 52 poems that would have had, that were just like full of violence and full of trauma. I mean, the topic itself it's serious and tragic enough, but then to kind of have like kind of specific details about that, I did not want to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I opted for something that hopefully, yes, it is a serious, serious subject matter, yet hopefully when people read the poems, they can see maybe a little bit of the beauty and kind of this specific details I wanted kind of about each woman.
And I really do feel like you give each woman this voice, this moment, this one page to kind of show you a little piece of who she is. You do a great job. I mean, I in some aspects I'm like, oh, I want to find the article. Who is she talking about, right? I want to read the stats, right? What are the facts that go with this? But like, I think that would take away from this beautiful like piece that you've given each of these women, just this moment to be separate from that. That's a thing that has happened. Like, we all have these things that have happened to us, but that doesn't make up who we are. Um, and so often, you're reading an article about someone that this horrible thing has happened to, and that's really all we're talking about. You get maybe a moment where she was going, where just right around the incident, and you barely ever learn much of anything about who these people really are. And um, I appreciate that. I love, like, if anything, that makes your collections stand out from many other poetry collections that I've
Well,
read.
thank you. I mean, I really was aiming for that. So maybe an example of that would be there was a young woman who she lived in New Jersey, and the year was 1964, and she was killed. And she lived, I think it might have been in Newark, and her body was found. Um, and so I looked at the year like 1964. I looked at the fact that she was living in New Jersey. And I kind of took poetic license, and I thought, she was maybe about 15 or 16. And I thought, probably at that time in 1964 in New Jersey, she would have been gung ho about the Beatles. I mean, there's a really good chance of that. I could be totally off the mark with it, but so I wrote about that a little bit, about her, maybe her liking the Beatles. There was another woman who, she was a baker, and she just decided that she wasn't going to go to work. Nobody ever saw her again. Um, and so I wrote kind of a little bit about like how loaves and sunrises, two things that rise, loaves
Right,
and suns,
right.
right? So the sun. So that's kind of the focus that I wanted, rather than dealing with really blunt reality.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of how I tried to kind of create all of this. And so I guess I would also say about that, when I was younger, much, much younger, and I know this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but I worked for an antique shop on Royal Street.
Hmm.
And my job, I loved that job, but my job was to write about antiques, to write about paintings or clocks or objects of art. And a lot of times, these paintings or these objects of art, they maybe had like the name of the artist. These were like really fourth and fifth tier artists. So there wasn't a lot of information about them.
Mhm.
So it became more about writing about the piece itself and maybe, what was in the painting and, what this still life could have represented. And, it was written it was composed at the time. So in a lot of ways, I think that these poems are kind of similar to that process.
That's fascinating. So when you had this job, were you also writing poetry? Like, or was this a precursor to your poetry life, or like had that already happened and then helped you with the job? Because this sounds like the great prompts. Every day you go into work and here's a new prompt. I love it.
Right. Right. No, it was a wonderful, wonderful job. It was, I worked with the owners of the shop were very eccentric. The people who worked there were very eccentric. They did not have, and this would have been like maybe around in the mid 90s, they did not have computers. So the first day that I started there was this like clicking of a typewriter, which just sounded so strange to me. And so, so I was writing poetry at that time. But in a lot of ways, I think that job really did give me kind of an aesthetic because I feel like my poems, um, like I always feel like they're within a frame, like they're kind of each their own entity a little bit. And so I think that job, and this was well before I started graduate school, I think that job was more influential than I realized. I realize it now, but then I was a lowly worker, a lowly paid worker. And the dilemma was I didn't make much money, but I was around beautiful things
Yeah.
and I got to write about them. So yeah, I think that job did help me in a lot of ways.
So Sandra has a question. Are the actual names of the victims used? And if yes, have any family members come forward?
The publisher decided not to use the names. I think because for that reason, it's a small press. And I think maybe using the names could have opened up a can of worms. When I originally submitted the manuscript, I did have the names of the victims. But the publisher was like, I don't want to have the names.
Mhm.
And I kind of deliberated about that. And I was like, yeah, I guess I can see why. And especially since, um, a lot of these, like there was one murder that happened, the one in 1964, and then there was one in the 1940s. And so possibly things could have changed since then. So there was a list initially, but there isn't with the collection now.
Do you um would you want to put it somewhere else? Not in the book, but on a website or something? I mean, like an honorary, even if they're not connected to each individual poem? That's just
That,
personal.
that's a good question. And I guess I could really see the value in doing that, because these women, I mean, not only, I mean, of course, they disappeared or they were murdered. and kind of now in this new situation, they were very inspirational to me.
Mm.
And so I do feel that they should be, maybe they should have that attribute, and they should be recognized, certainly for what happened to them, but maybe because they were a source of inspiration too. I
Yeah.
can see that.
So, Sandra says that's understandable. Not using the actual names likely doesn't detract from the poem's power. And I have to say, just as a reader, I don't think so at all. I didn't. You build their character. What their name is not.
And I think if I would have provided the names, then maybe that would have caused people to do research. I don't know. It could have made for maybe some unpleasant situations for families. I don't know. I don't know. But initially I thought that that was going to happen. But, you always kind of, I don't know, think things over, mull things over, and then in mulling it over, it seemed like this was the best way to handle it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, there's two layers too. Like the families obviously being able to easily find out and read them, but also like as just a reader who's enjoying the book. I said to you earlier, like in some ways I felt like, oh, I wanted more research, wanted to know the facts, but at the same time, I would have had to work at it to get them. And I was like, well, it's not, no, I don't want to do that. And if you had just had the name and the state, well, that's just going to pop right up in Google. And now I think, I don't know, your poems are carry a magic that I think a fear could be broken if now I'm looking at a crime scene photo and you know, things I don't want to think of.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, um, this is forcing us to think about something that isn't pleasant, and it kind of gets us to look at maybe the bigger picture of that, rather than, certainly there are individual circumstances, but if anything, I think that maybe if having the names of the victims, that might have caused us to not want to think about it. You know what I mean? Like that could have happened too. So I don't know. It is the way that it is now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think it's for the better, honestly. To have them with the book. If you chose to honor them as inspiration or their memory in some other play, location and time and other venue, I would understand that. But I think inside the book, as it is, it's perfect.
the other thing too, is that I think that each woman lived in each state, and kind of what happened when I was writing this book is that, um, yes, the book was about the victims, and yet the book, I think, also is about the American landscape, because a place is very much a part of these poems. And so that is kind of like almost like a happy accident that happened with the collection, was that, what maybe I didn't know specifically about each victim, I could kind of funnel some of that into knowing about where she lived. What was it like in New York in the wintertime? What was it like in New Mexico? And so, in some ways, I think that the book really, yes, it's about the victims, but the American landscape is really not too far behind that.
Well, I love how you're saying that it's almost like a happy accident. You intended to be representative, but then all of a sudden you look at it and then, oh, I'm representing the country. And you're so right, where you're from and where you live, whether you've been there for a month or whether you've been there for your whole life, it does factor into your environment, who you are. It's shaping you all the time. I love that. Sandra also says that she's reading Spoon River Anthology right now, rereading it. And I'm curious about the collective message of the poems taken together. So, you were kind of just speaking to that as well.
Yeah.
For sure. So, see what I'm fidgeting. So I'm fidgeting.
Oh, that's, yeah. And I'm
Before,
having another sip, so.
yeah. Before we went live, I was talking about like fidgeting with my hair and trying to figure out what to do with it. That it doesn't, you don't fidget, but then you do it. And also, Debbie said earlier that there's some background noise. I unplugged my headset, so hopefully that got a little better. I don't know if that's what it was or not. There's also a little bit of snoring in the background.
It could be the dog. I'm sorry. I can try and get her to move, but
I think she's adorable.
Okay. If it's too much, I can shoo her out. So
I say let her stay.
it's our own version of white noise back here. So
Exactly. So when you were at you did the Lucky Bean reading on Monday, you read some poems that you worked on after this book. So let me ask you about those and other ones. Like, when you write, are you writing with the idea of putting them in a book, or are you usually like writing? Because poetry is different than like writing a novel or even a nonfiction, book that you intend to be a full book. You're on topic and you're staying, and you get up in the morning and you do your writing toward that end goal. When you write, do you usually write toward that end goal of a book, or you're just writing?
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, for this, I knew that I wanted to make a collection, that I wanted to create that. And honestly, like, I actually love poems that kind of have that are a theme, or that they're connected. So I wrote, and you can't really see it here, but there was a collection that I wrote in 2017, and that was a book of poems that were inspired by Marc Chagall paintings. And it was called Fitting the Sixth Finger. I'm thinking I have it here. Is this it? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, this is it. And so this was that book. And so same kind of thing. I gave my husband this book about Marc Chagall, and it was meant for him, but I kind of took it over, and I started like looking at these Marc Chagall paintings and just really looking at those paintings. And I began to write some ekphrastic poetry. And at first, when I wrote the first one, I was like, oh, this is kind of like a dream poem. I'm going to write dream poems. And I kind of kept looking through the book, and I would write a poem, and I was like, well, no, these are really, like so many of Marc Chagall's paintings, they're like dreams, right? With the couple flying up in the air, and they're in love with each other, and they kind of defy gravity, kind of like what happens in dreams. So that was kind of another collection that I wrote, where I was like really kind of, I get fixated on things. I was really fixated on those Chagall poems. And then I also got fixated with Carville, Louisiana, and that was the site of the leper colony. And so I wrote a small collection about that. So it kind of varies for me. Sometimes it's, very, very driven by like a theme, and other times it's just maybe kind of poems at random,
Yeah, I completely get that. Sometimes you get in a groove about something that is inspiring you at the moment, and you just keep going with it. And maybe there's enough for a book or some sort of collection, and sometimes it's just for you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, whatever it is, a poem, however, whether or not it's part of something, a collection, or if it's just I mean, I'll take whatever that poem, however it kind of presents itself,
Absolutely. Yeah. I've been trying to get better into a writing habit because I it comes and goes, right? So I'm like, I have time to do it, or sometimes I feel particularly inspired. I sit down and write something, but I've been trying to get better into like an actual routine, like at least 10 minutes a day, which isn't a lot, but like it's the routine I feel like that matters. Do you have a writing routine thing like
Uh,
that, or
well, like for the past 6 or 7 weeks, no, I've not been writing anything. And I feel that,
Mhm.
but I know like Sylvia Plath, like she wrote every day, every day she carved time out. I'm looking for her collection here, but she carved time out to write every day. Um, and so I used to worry if it's been a while since I've written a poem, like, oh no, maybe everything's just drying up, or oh no, that's like the last thing I ever have to say. And different people have different processes. Like I get really kind of like bothered if it's a while since I've written a poem. My husband, on the other hand, he's like he's very relaxed about it. Like he doesn't have like this type A personality when it comes to writing. I kind of wish I had his attitude and could be a little more relaxed about things.
well, and I also feel like there's this, what if it never comes back? Like, what if I'm never inspired again to write anything? It's all just going to be grocery lists from now on. I've got nothing.
Right. Right.
Yeah. The confidence to just be like, yeah, when it comes, it comes. That'll be, that's great. Sounds great.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, I grocery lists and I don't know, but yeah, I don't know. I think maybe we all kind of have a little bit of that fear. I know that's a fear of mine for sure.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, it's adjacent, but a lot of people, when COVID first hit, read way more than they've ever read in their lives. And other people were just like, I can't read. And I was much more in that. Nothing is doing it for me. Like, I'm just not getting into anything I'm reading. And there was a moment, I mean, like 3 or 4 months in, I had only read like a few books, which is not, I mean, I'm reading like 9 to 12 books a month usually. And
Wow.
I'm reading like two, one, and I'm like, so please don't let this, how do I continue to be a bookseller if I can only read 2 books a month? Like, and it does. And the fear that like the pleasure of it will never come back. And of course it did, but it took a while.
It totally did. I mean, like it's funny because I was the opposite. So I read not one, not two, but three Donna Tartt novels, like among like the books that I was reading. And I kind of felt like I had returned to my days as a young English major, where I was like reading and reading voraciously. Because I kind of felt like, yes, I mean, I guess I could have binge watched. I did that too, but it just seemed like it was kind of a healthier mindset for me to
Mhm.
read. It was a strange time, it really, really was, and how we all responded to that.
Mhm. For sure. I'm happy to report that a lot of people, at least that I've seen, have kept reading, even though we've gone back to work and school and all of that. And then that was the thing, as a bookseller, I was like, oh, all these people are reading either new or reading again. But is it going to last? And I'm sure there's some people who, went back to work and just never picked up a book again. But there's a lot of people who come in and say, well, I got back into reading just in the last couple of years. I'm like, oh, this is
Yeah.
this is exactly what I wanted to hear. You know?
Yeah, of course. You would want to hear
Right.
that.
I mean, I want people to read whether they're buying books from me or not, but I want people to just read and because it's such a pleasurable experience for me. And I also want to encourage everyone, like I'm preaching to the choir because everyone who's watching right now is clearly going to a literary event, but tell your friends, like if they read and they don't go to events, they should. It is a magical experience to be there and like with poetry to really experience the poet reading their poems, their works, and in fiction and nonfiction, if that's what you read, you go and go to the event and really get to like meet the author and ask them a question and hear their story about the book. It adds so much to the experience of reading. And I run into people all the time. It was like didn't even know it was a thing, like that there are book events, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's my whole job. But yes, you should come to events.
Yeah, no, it's funny because of course with COVID, like I haven't been going to nearly as many things as I did at one time. But most recently, I went to hear Dana Joya speak. He was at Tulane. He was at UNO too, but I couldn't make the time. And so it was, it was the middle of the week, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going. I haven't been to a literary event like this. It's been a while. I'm going. And it was great. I mean, like kind of listening to what he had to say about poetry. He could recite his poems from memory. I can't do that, and I'm a lot younger than he is, but like he could recite his poems from memory and just kind of, and it felt really so good to be like kind of in that literary moment, in that literary setting, you know what I mean, where like it was live, it was real. So yeah, definitely come out and hear poets whenever you
Exactly.
can.
So speaking of hearing poets, Debbie she's gonna wrap this up for us perfectly. She says that your compassion shines through your tribute to these women. And will you share a reading with us in your voice?
Oh, sure.
We'll have Gina read a couple
Sure.
poems to kind of close out
And
our win.
I can't see who the Debbie is, but I have a feeling that it's a Debbie that I've known for a long time. Is that true, Debbie?
Debbie Stack.
Yes. Okay. I thought it was Debbie. Yes. Okay. All right, Debbie. So I'm going to read kind of the first poem in the collection. Um, and this poem, I'll say it's a lot different than the others are because it's more of a narrative poem. And the others aren't, but this is kind of what got everything started. And it's the first poem in the book. And so it's called When We Wore Ponchos. The missing girl, hair parted to the side, photographed in her poncho, similar to the one I wore and loved. A little furry and looking like it held fire long since ignited, fringed in red and orange notions, trim threads, acute points grazing knees, fingers. Hers was more patriotic, navy fleece with blurry white stars, minus fringe, fraying, then ripping, from the shove, struggle, and strangulation by a man who left her ditched down, standing water, mud, and gravel, the horrid earth in clumps around her poncho, soiling those stars and torso, hands, limbs, mornings and afternoons, my mother quick with warnings. Each time I wished she would stop about not stopping for anyone, offering glimpses of newly found puppies or needing directions to the lakes and lagoons where the jasmine grew pervasive, gnarled around limbs and stumps. Her tone underscores, oddly italicized. I knew, I knew, and tried my very best to heed, to come straight home. So did that girl whose poncho could not insulate her from harm. Thank you. Thanks.
Do you want to read
Um,
more?
Do we want to read a couple more, maybe one or two more? Or,
Yeah.
okay.
We'll do two more. It'll be perfect.
Okay. Let's see. I think I'm gonna read, and Raina, I apologize. You heard me read this one the other night.
Oh,
But I'm
not
gonna
for
read
me,
it.
for all these lovely people.
I'm gonna read it again. And so this takes place in Texas, and it's Prism Explanation of a Name. You are named for something explicable that appears miraculous, a dichotomy of the sublime meeting the scientific. Yes, dispersion from glass and crystal, specifically cut flat, a triangle, a tear, sometimes a stemless pear that separates ordinary white light and quotidian beams into colors that seem otherworld ethereal, with an ability to painlessly pierce in electric iridescence, occasionally seen in sunrises and sunsets, when someone should bear witness to those rainbows that vanish, losing their arcs, just like you did after it rained with your contained litany of colors.
I
And
like this.
then
I'm the only one
I'm
to
gonna
come.
I'm gonna read. So this is the poem. This is a poem for the young woman who got all of this started, Linda O'Keefe. And some things to know about her is that, like myself, she wasn't the greatest of students. She had to attend summer school. I was always, and Debbie will tell you, I was always just terrible in math. I lived in fear of failing math. And so she also, her mother made many of her clothes. And so this is a poem about her, and it's called Honestly Fabricated, California. When I wasn't a memory, the chosen, always mine, blue flowers and willows, the diamond print on cotton in shades of precious gems, taffeta and its leaf-like autumnal rustle, puckered piqué and dotted Swiss, raised like braille, plush, velour, and velveteen, reminiscent of soil revealing the unearthed, no longer too wide or long, remnants, castaways to touch me before the vertical mirror, where I twisted scraps, pulling to unwind, between slack and taut, the days my clothes were made by my mother's needle and will.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Perfect examples of everything we've been talking about this evening. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thanks.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. I truly appreciate you joining me for Book Banter and this poetry collection. 2 thumbs up, mini claps, mini snaps.
Thank you. Thanks.
I put a in the comments there. Gina's book isn't on our website yet, but you can stop in, you can call us, or you can send us an email. I put all that information there in the comments. So please grab yourself a copy and yeah, have a lovely night, everybody.
Thank you, Raina. And thanks for everybody coming out. Take care and have a good evening.